Mr. Secretary, I applaud you. I thank you. We will be watching you. And it is my pleasure and distinct honor to introduce the Secretary of the United States, Sir Anthony Blinken.
Well, thank you all very, very much. Terrence, that's a hard act to follow, but one I'm incredibly gratified to follow, and I take your powerful, eloquent words to heart. I usually get to say, wherever I'm speaking, that it's an honor to be here. It really is an honor to be here today. This event, this moment, has deep meaning for me, but much more important than that, for this institution, for those assembled today, but especially for the generations to come who will walk through those doors. And we had a chance, Terrence, Patricia, Ambassador Abercrombie-Winston and I, to stand in front of the doors just a few moments ago, where Terrence Tobin's name is now there for all to see. And just to think for a minute about what that means for all these years to come, as generation after generation of Foreign Service officers and civil servants, visitors, dignitaries, come into this place that will be hopping and thriving again, and look up and see the name and ask, who was that? Why is the name there? And then we will have a story to tell, and a story that resonates to this day and inspires us to carry on what he started. So it is an honor to celebrate the truly extraordinary service of Ambassador Terrence Tobin and the reason we're here today. I do want to recognize some members of the family. Besides his son Terrence, his daughter Patricia, here with us today, Michael, and his late daughter Catherine. And his partner for more than 6 decades, Doris, who I believe is tuning in from St. Thomas, excuse me. Do I have that right? Is she in fact tuned in? I hope so. But St. Thomas, where she and the ambassador graduated from Charlotte Amalie High School in 1944. To try to grasp all that Ambassador Tobin achieved, it's important to understand the State Department where he made his indelible mark. In 1926, when Terrence Tobin was born to a laundress and a grocery store clerk, one of 13 siblings, the department was almost entirely white and entirely male. Only 2 years before his birth, the Rogers Act created the Foreign Service exam, which promised that State Department appointments would be made on merit, not based on who you were or who you knew. But that same year, the chairman of the Foreign Service Personnel Board made clear to reviewers that any black applicant who passed the written exam should be rejected in the oral exam. The board's executive committee even drafted a memo suggesting that President Coolidge issue an executive order to, and I quote, relieve the government of the necessity, end quote, of appointing blacks, women, and naturalized citizens. Over the next 2 decades, as Terrence became the first member of his family to graduate from high school, only a handful of black men were able to join the Foreign Service. At their urging, in 1949, the department carried out a study on opportunities for black staff. America's first black ambassador, Edward Dudley, and his team led this effort. The findings were stark. From 1925 to 1949, black Foreign Service officers and other staff had spent 92% of their time rotating between 3 so-called hardship posts: Liberia, where Dudley was ambassador, Madagascar, and the Azores, what came to be known as the Circuit. Black people in the department, the report concluded, were, and I quote, drastically restricted in their opportunities for transfer as compared with the opportunities afforded by their colleagues of equal rank and length of service. The report was not made public, and while a few additional black foreign service officers were assigned to South Asia and Europe, the circuit mostly lived on. This was the institution that Terence joined in 1952. The first morning he reported to work, the chief of personnel told him that the department couldn't hire him. In the official's words, they needed people who were, and I quote, 100% identifiable as Americans. Terence demanded a chance to speak with the director of the Office of South Asian Affairs, where he'd been assigned. William Whitman II was the archetype of the department. White, male, Yale, as the saying goes. He told Terence the job would be a lot of work, that he couldn't afford to waste any spots. Terence said this, "If you didn't have work for me, I wouldn't want to be in your office." Whitman gave Ambassador Tobin a shot, which was all he ever needed, all he ever wanted. Years later, when he was appointed ambassador to Togo, Whitman asked Terence to be his deputy. In those first years at state, Terence has said, people would regularly knock on his door looking for Mr. Tobin. And he'd say, "Well, I'm Mr. Tobin. Come on in." And they'd say, "You've got to be kidding me." Ambassador Tobin later said, "It took them a while to accept that I could be the person responsible for some activities," which was putting it diplomatically. His first posting abroad was to India, where he was initially given the assignments that no one else wanted. One was writing a report on wheat production in preparation for a visit by a congressional delegation from the Midwest. Terence threw himself into that work. He met with small farmers, with agronomists, with local businessmen, people he could talk to because he'd learned Hindi. The report was so impressive that he was asked to brief the congressman in person. And the U.S. ambassador at the time, the great Ellsworth Bunker, started taking Terence with him whenever he traveled to the field. That was the approach that Ambassador Tobin brought to every assignment. We heard some of that from his son. He never relied on secondhand reports when he could speak to people directly. Not just officials, but the people who were living the issues that he was working on. The rice farmer in India, the military officer in Tunis, the labor organizer in San Juan. And Ambassador Tobin knew that to engage people, he needed the language. So he put in the hard work to learn languages wherever he went. Terence Jr. remembers seeing his dad late at night and on weekends, sitting down in front of an old-fashioned reel-to-reel player recorder, listening to Arabic language audio tapes. Having the language meant that there was no person Ambassador Tobin couldn't speak to or listen to. And that was important because he believed he could learn from everyone. Now, I suspect part of this is because Tobin knew how much was missed when certain people were overlooked, ignored, not heard because of who they were or how they looked. For him, there were no less thans, only fellow human beings. Another part of his approach was Terence's commitment to learning everything that there was to know before reaching a conclusion. Knowing your facts. That was what was expected, whether you served under Ambassador Tobin or, as I've heard indirectly, sitting around the kitchen table. If you took a position, you'd better be able to back it up. A junior officer who worked for Terence decades later when he was ambassador to Spain remembered that he arrived at the office every morning having read all the major Spanish and international papers. That approach helped Ambassador Tobin make remarkable contributions over his decades of service. To name just one, when he was appointed Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Carter administration, he was charged with reopening diplomatic talks with Cuba. The first meeting was held in New York on a very bleak winter's day. When the Cuban delegation arrived, Ambassador Tobin walked over, extended a hand, and in perfect Spanish, assured them that the warmth of the talks would more than make up for the freezing temperatures outside. And he remembered seeing immediate relief on the faces of the Cuban guests. Having learned in advance that the head of the Cuban delegation suffered from an ulcer, Ambassador Tobin made sure to have warm milk on hand, a remedy that brought him some relief. Whenever the talks hit a snag, he'd call a recess. The two would meet by the milk to iron it out. When Fidel Castro wanted to finish the negotiations in Havana, some in the administration were reluctant to let Ambassador Tobin lead the U.S. delegation. He told them, "If you don't think I'm able to take care of our interests in dealing with Castro, then I shouldn't be Assistant Secretary of State." They relented. Terrence delivered. The talks led to a series of agreements, including the opening of the first U.S. interest section in Havana. This happened again and again during Ambassador Tobin's career. He was an extraordinary diplomat. But because he was a black diplomat, he was routinely forced to prove himself worthy to serve the country that he loved. This, as you've heard, is what so rankled him early on in his career about not being able to eat in a nearby restaurant while studying at the Foreign Service Institute. It wasn't just the indignity of it, or the fact that at the same time they were being trained to represent the United States abroad, they were being treated as less than equal at home. It was, as Terrence Jr. later put it, that his father couldn't understand why anyone would want to put obstacles in the way of the best people serving their country. And that's exactly what we're so inspired by today. That's exactly why there's a direct thread between Ambassador Tobin and the work that Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley is doing, that we're doing together to make sure that we have a department that reflects the country that we serve, that reflects the best of our country in all its diversity, in all its strength. To do otherwise is to shortchange our country. And it's thanks to Ambassador Tobin that we are carrying out this work. This is his legacy, too. Now, he didn't set out to be a troublemaker, a good troublemaker. John Lewis would so appreciate. But he was willing to make trouble when he believed it was in the best interests of the United States. It's the reason he spent his career trying to change the system from within so that it would attract and promote outstanding black diplomats. It was a point he raised in every meeting that he ever had with a Secretary of State, and he met more than his share and worked with more than his share. And as he said, and I quote, "I've always contended that you don't do this for minorities, you do this for the United States. We need, as a country, the very best input that we can get." And that's exactly what this is about. For him, mentorship was a part of patriotism, a way of shoring up people who might otherwise give up on serving a country that kept asking them to prove themselves. It's why he played a leading role in the Thursday Luncheon Group, which was created back in 1973 to provide advice and fellowship for black foreign and civil servants as they navigated the obstacles here at State. It's why he made a point of staying in touch with junior black diplomats for years after they'd worked for him. And it's why he sought postings that broke down barriers, like when he accepted the ambassadorship to Costa Rica after serving ambassador to Guinea. On paper, it was considered a move to a lower-tiered post, but for Ambassador Tobin, it was a chance to break out of the circuit, to show once again that he could be an extraordinary public servant anywhere. As both Terrence Jr. and Gina said, the best way to honor his legacy is for this department to take up the work of attracting and advancing the best people, regardless of who they are, rather than leaving that work to individuals like him. And that's why we're working with such urgency to learn how previous efforts have fallen short, to put what we learned out in the open, to systematically eliminate every obstacle, close every gap. One way we can do that is by empowering everyone throughout the department to highlight the remarkable contributions of people like Ambassador Tobin and the perpetual battles that they waged to make those contributions. Which brings us finally full circle to today. 2005, an American diplomat named Yolanda Kearney arrived in Guinea for her first tour as a Foreign Service officer. Walking the halls of our embassy, she saw one photo after another of former U.S. ambassadors, all white men. Then she stopped. There on the wall was a photograph of Ambassador Tobin. The embassy was being rebuilt at the time. The more Yolanda learned about him, the more she thought it would be a good idea to name part of the compound in his honor. But at the time, she didn't feel that she could put that idea forward. Well, Yolanda is now our diplomat in residence in Washington, D.C. It was her idea, together with other colleagues, Miriam Safi, Charlena Hussein Morgan, to name this cafeteria in Ambassador Tobin's honor. And working with Gina, here we are. They made it happen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have a feeling this would make Ambassador Tobin very proud. And knowing what I now know of him, I suspect it would make him even prouder to see that women like Yolanda, Miriam, Charlena, who represent the very best of our nation, are leading new generations in this department as we take this unfinished work forward. Thank you very much. Come on up. Okay.